Section 12 of Sir Francis Drake by Julian Corbett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Great Mistake. At home for more than a year, nothing had been heard of Drake beyond a rumour that he had been taken by the Spaniards and hanged. That the Doughty plot had failed and that the Queen's chief pirate had entered the South Sea was known to the government. Winter had brought the news in the summer of 1579, together with a report of the chaos of storm into which the Golden Hind had disappeared. Burleigh and the party with which he was acting were consoling themselves with the reflection that their bugbear must certainly have gone to the bottom, when one day toward the end of August, Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, sprang upon them the astounding news which the Viceroy of Mexico had just had the pleasure of sending home. The peace party were aghast. Except the vague report of Drake's execution, there seemed nothing between them and war, and Walsingham could rub his hands over the success of his scheme. Philip, however, was as slow as Elizabeth was irresolute. Moreover, his hands were full of his preparations to seize the inheritance of the dying King of Portugal, and Mendoza was instructed to accept the Queen's excuse. She had protested that Drake was a private adventurer, and that she had nothing to object to his alleged execution, and that if he ever came home he would be severely dealt with. So all the warlike ambassador could do was to sit down and watch like a lynx for the pirate's reappearance. Such was the welcome that awaited the Golden Hind, as one day about Michaelmas 1580, worm-eaten and weed-clogged, she laboured into Plymouth Sound. Drake no doubt was ready, as he always was, to be disowned, and if necessary to disappear, and no sooner had his anchor plunged triumphantly into the well-known waters than his friends warned him of his peril. With characteristic decision he immediately warped out his priceless burden behind St. Nicholas Island, and making the plague which had been raging in Plymouth his excuse, refused to land. There he lay defiantly while his messengers sped to court, and amidst the wonder of his friends and the caresses of his wife he resolutely awaited the end. In a week came a summons to court. Drake obeyed at once, but he did not go alone. He had received letters of advice from his great friends, and in his company went a train of pack-horses laden with the cream of his plunder. It was oil to assuage the storm which Mendoza was brewing in the council. Burleigh and the more earnest of the peace party refused his gifts with scorn, but still Drake had no cause to lose heart. He reached London in a moment so happy that it would almost seem again as though some fairy godmother had waved her wand to save him. The council had recently learnt for certain that Philip had seized Portugal almost without a blow, and that Don Antonio, the pretender to the throne, had been hunted from the realm like a wild beast. To the fabulous power and wealth he already possessed, Philip at a stroke had added the vast possessions of Portugal. The whole world seemed stretched at his feet. The great Armada in Cadiz was still unused and free to strike no one knew where. Fearing the worst, the council with feverish haste were pushing forward military preparations, when the very week that Drake came home, news reached London that a Spanish force had landed in Ireland. England's hour seemed come at last. Half the council were in despair and ready to have peace on any terms, when suddenly the tone of English diplomacy changed to a ringing note of resistance. For the Queen's little pirate was whispering in her ear as he walked beside her, relating his adventures, that though the whole world were the King of Spain's garden, yet it was hers to pluck the fruit as she would. Mendoza raged, but nothing could he get save an order to Edmund Tremayne at Plymouth to register the plunder and send it up to London. Tremayne was an old confidant of the Queen's, and on the heels of the order Drake followed with a private letter under her sign manual, telling the Devon justice to turn his back while her well-beloved subject secretly abstracted £10,000 worth of bullion for himself. It was a sum equal to about £80,000 of our money, and this was part of his reward. Still the Queen would not openly recognise him. Though she refused to see Mendoza while a single Spanish musketeer remained in Ireland, still in her usual way she attempted to allay his anger. An inquiry was held, at which the whole of Drake's crew swore that not a single act of cruelty had been committed as the Spaniards alleged, and so much of the plunder as Tremayne chose to see was registered, sent up to the Tower, and a return given to the ambassador. But each day he grew more furious. Drake came back to town bringing up the Golden Hind for all the world to stare at. He was the lion of the hour, and every day had long interviews with the Queen, so charmed was she with her little pirate and what he had brought back. In vain Mendoza and his friends tried to frighten the London merchants with the prospect of war, or an embargo at least. The splendour of Drake's achievement and the richness of his presents turned everyone's head. Rumour swelled the amount of the plunder to a fabulous extravagance. His very crew seemed princes in their splendour. 2 years ago, beside Doughty's grave, they had agreed to stand to their captain's courtesy, and so well had he treated them that the people ran out of their houses as they swaggered by to wonder at their wealth. So in spite of all Mendoza could threaten, louder and louder grew the exultation as the news of the triumphant exploit spread through the realm and waked in the farthest hamlet the old fierce spirit of the 100 Years' War. Still Mendoza, with the support he had in council, was dangerous, and Leicester and his fellow shareholders tried to bribe him. The attempt only made his complaints the more indignant, and as month after month of intrigue went by, people were still uncertain whether, after all, Drake or his treasure would not have to be given up. But Elizabeth never doubted a moment. She and Walsingham had fresh work for him to do. Terceira, one of the Azores, had refused to recognise the Spanish conquest, and Don Antonio, having escaped to Paris with his life and the Braganza jewels, was crying lustily for help to go and support his faithful subjects. Walsingham saw the opportunity. Drake and his contemporaries were lifting naval warfare to a new level, and the far-sighted foreign minister was the first to learn the lesson their exploits taught. Hitherto the navy had been the mere handmaid of the military, and had been used by belligerents for nothing more intelligent than raids upon each other's coasts. But now the wisest heads in England began to divine for it a higher function than the paltry cross-ravaging of the Middle Ages, and to see the tremendous weapon a powerful fleet would be in the hands of the power that first used it against an enemy's trade. It is Drake's chief claim to be called a great admiral that he was the pioneer of this strategic revolution. Above all countries, Spain was most exposed to such an attack, and he saw that the moment had come. Terceira was on the direct road of the fleets returning both from the East and West Indies, and Drake told the Queen that if he might seize it in Antonio's name and act from it as a base, he could so utterly destroy the trade of Spain that she would be able to dictate her own terms of reconciliation. Elizabeth seized the bait. Whether or not she grasped the whole significance of Drake's proposal, a privateer war in a pretender's name was irresistible to her tortuous statecraft. By March it was already whispered that Mr. Drake was going on a second voyage, well furnished and countenanced. Walsingham was busy working out alternative projects, and in April the Queen threw off all disguise. Drake's worm-eaten ship had been hauled ashore at Deptford, and on the 4th of the month the Queen went down, and after a banquet on board, publicly knighted the master thief of the unknown world. The Golden Hind was ordered to be preserved for ever as a worthy rival of Magellan's Victoria, and all the world knew at last that the King of Spain's long legs were in sore danger. In July the expedition was ready to sail. Hawkins and Drake had arranged it together. Courtiers and merchants had freely subscribed the cost, and every adventurous spirit had flocked to their flag. Norris, Bingham, Carleill, and all the rest were there, and Fenton and York, Frobisher's favourite lieutenants were each in command of ships. Don Antonio had come over, and after a secret interview with the Queen had pawned his jewels and gone down to Plymouth. Nothing was wanting but the order to sail. But day after day went by, and nothing but scolding came from the Queen. As usual with her, on the eve of doing something heroic, she was losing heart and fretting herself into a state of nervous irritability. She was angry because Drake had spent £2,000 more than the estimate. She could not get a definite answer from the French king that the contingent he had promised was going to sail, and she was fast persuading herself that by a renewal of her flirtation with the Duc d'Alençon she could frighten Spain into condoning Drake's offences. As the days went by in inaction, Drake lost his temper too. No doubt he was not less masterful since his brilliant reception, and his splendid self-reliance was more than ever impatient of restraint. Pardonably jealous of his sudden predominance, the Irish officers and Frobisher's men found unendurable his habit of listening to everyone's advice and always taking his own. York was even suspected of treachery, and by the middle of August, when sailing orders were hourly expected, so acute had the friction grown that they had all found it necessary to resign their commissions. Drake and Hawkins had triumphed. The whole affair was now in the hands of their own set. But still no letter came from the King of France, and in a week, afraid to act and afraid to draw back, Elizabeth had hit on one of her disastrous compromises. She had resolved to send a little squadron under Norris and young William Hawkins, and to pay off the rest of the fleet. Don Antonio refused such pitiful patronage, and after vainly trying to recover his jewels, retired to France in a rage. William Burrows, of Muscovy fame, came down with a commission to break up the expedition, and so ended one of the most brilliant projects that a far-sighted strategy ever hatched. Drake's deep disappointment is easy to picture, but the Queen would not hear of either his or Hawkins leaving the country. Till she had pushed France into the fire, she did not mean to provoke Spain further, and till Spain was occupied with a French war, she wanted her best men at her side. So in organisation and routine work, Drake had plenty to do for his wayward mistress. He was chosen mayor of Plymouth too, and was soon busy with projects for its improvement and defence. Nor was this all. Leicester, bent on saving something from the wreck of the abortive venture in which he had been deeply engaged, resolved to organise from its ruins an expedition to carry out one of Walsingham's alternative schemes. It was for a trading and exploring voyage into the East Indies, to widen the opening which Drake had begun. Again an attempt was made to combine the two sets, and the command was divided between Fenton and William Hawkins. Drake, like most other people, knew how incapable Fenton was, but at Leicester's entreaty he loyally did his best, both with money and advice, to make the thing a success, and Fenton handsomely acknowledged his generosity. So the expedition sailed next year with all the prestige of the great navigator's support, but Fenton's stupidity and his jealousy of his brilliant young lieutenant and the rest of Drake's men proved invincible, and the affair ended in complete disaster. Thus it was that, as well as he could, surrounded by treachery and jealousy, Drake tried to carry on his life's work. When the Queen had finally refused to give him up, Philip too had recognized the feud. He was keen enough to see in the Puritan corsair an arch enemy, and diplomacy failing, he stealthily drew his favourite weapon. Knowing well that Drake had enemies, and above all that Doughty's brother was living for revenge, he offered a sum of more than £40,000 of our money to anyone who would assassinate or kidnap the renowned corsair. Spanish owners who had suffered from Drake's depredations, with faith unshaken in his clemency to private citizens, were sending over an agent to make terms with him. This man was charged with the mission, and he at once approached John Doughty, who had naturally found it impossible to get any redress for his brother's death. For obvious reasons, Drake's opponents in the council dared not call the execution in question. They had even to assent to its procedure being used as a precedent in Fenton's official instructions. Doughty therefore eagerly embraced his only chance of revenge. The matter was settled, and of course Doughty began boasting of what he was going to do, just as before he had boasted of his skill in the black art. Drake soon learned of his folly, obtained his arrest from the council, and a spy of the Spanish agents confessed the whole crime on the rack. So the tragedy ended. Doughty remained in prison, and save for one despairing cry for his release, so far as we know, was never heard of again. But so far from its being the end of Philip's projects, he was more than ever bent on revenge for all the stripes he had received. While the year 1583 wore away in ominous quiet, while Drake was mourning the loss of his wife, and as a member of the Navy Commission was arranging a peace footing for the fleet from which it could be rapidly mobilized, the arch schemer of the Escurial was piling up his great French plot to crush his island enemy. In November it all came to light, and from Scotland, France, and Spain a simultaneous invasion was threatened upon a country scored with treason. Then at last the Queen awoke, and while the fleet in 3 divisions watched for the coming blows, the nation armed. Mendoza was expelled, the seaports fortified, the borders strengthened, and Catholics arrested wholesale. The immediate danger passed, but the effect of the shock remained. Burleigh was now all for action, and ere the year was out, hands had been joined with the Prince of Orange. Drake, as member for Bosny, was voting supplies and death to traitors at Westminster, and in his pocket were orders that were destined to mark the point where the tide of Spanish Empire turned. End of section 12.